Good morning, saints. I read this morning from the book of Revelation, chapter 21. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "See, the home of God is among mortals. He will dwell with them. They will be his peoples. And God will himself wipe away every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more, for the first things have passed away." And the one who was seated on the throne said, "See, I am making all things new." Also he said, "Write this, for these words are trustworthy and true." Then he said to me, "It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To the thirsty I will give water as a gift from the spring of the water of life." May God bless the hearing of his word in our lives this day. Not too long ago, I read an email or blog posting that reported on how frequently pastors preached on certain topics. To this researcher's surprise and to his disappointment, he reported that across the denominational spectrum, one of the topics least preached upon was death. Death, dying, heaven. As for the reason for such avoidance, the researcher put it simply: we don't want to talk about it. Recently, while preparing a funeral message, I realized my own failure to help persons prepare for something that is natural and normal: death, in the embrace of the resurrection promise. So, it's All Saints' Day, and I propose to make the case that faith in Jesus Christ makes it possible for Christians to embrace both the reality and the sadness of death, along with the certainty and the joy of the resurrection, without resorting to religious mythology. Our confidence is based upon nothing more and nothing less than a personal relationship with Jesus, who is the crucified Lord and the resurrected Christ. Now, like many of you, the death of a family pet was my first and earliest memory of dealing with loss. Maud, our basset hound, enjoyed trailing behind the troop of kids that lived in our neighborhood. One afternoon, a truck driver making deliveries waited patiently as this crowd of kids crossed the street and then made the turn. What the man didn't see was the dog that followed. For me, the event was sad, but it wasn't traumatic. Jumping ahead 6 years, I'm a 7th grader when the call came telling us that Grandpa Wallace died. Since our visits were infrequent and Grandpa had been bedridden for the previous 4 years, again his death presented a reality, but without personal sadness. Then over the ensuing 6 years, events such as the Cuban Missile Crisis, assassinations, the Vietnam War, melded with the expanding awareness that develops when a child travels through the teen years into early adulthood. For me, there remained a veneer of invulnerability until my 2nd year in college. Then I got a letter from home telling me that a close friend from high school died in a car accident. Then, shortly thereafter, I was going on Thanksgiving break. A classmate drove. He dropped me off in Orangeburg, South Carolina. Hank got off in Charleston. Ed was going on to Savannah before the driver would arrive home in a town nearby. A heavy rain covered the area that night, and before arriving in Savannah, the car slid off the highway. The driver was unscathed, but Ed died suddenly. Ed and I participated in the Campus Christian Fellowship and attended a class called The New Testament in Modern Man. You could call it Modern Man when all of the students at Davidson at that time were guys. Prior to the long weekend, our class submitted our term papers. At the first session afterwards, Dr. Buttrick read sections from Ed's paper. His focus was upon the presence and promise of God when confronting death. The irony of Ed writing about death and his subsequent sudden death at 19 years bothered me, along with the fact that we ended our conversation, made plans, and said goodbye 2 hours prior to the accident. As children, the topic of death can mystify, frighten, and fascinate. Most youngsters are not ready to cover the full understanding of death, but the failure to talk with our children about its reality sets up what I experienced: the inability to come to terms with my friend Ed's death, and thus leaving room for fear to fester. When such fears, questions, and uncertainties go unaddressed, we become vulnerable to contemporary death mythologies. A mythology is a collection of stories, often belonging to a particular culture, that tries to give explanation for things we do not understand, from our history, from customs, and especially matters of life and death. When confronted by the death of somebody close to us, we sometimes resort to mythology to give explanation to the upsurge of emotion we're feeling. Like, for instance, if the deceased is a person who enjoyed gardening, we say that heaven is a place where they're now tending God's landscape. We don't know that, but it's a comforting mythology. We want to know the person we cherished is all right. We are curious and sometimes desperate to find out what existence beyond this life is like. You've heard the adage, knowledge is power. It's as if we get an answer, we'll have some kind of control over life and death. That is why the speculative attracts us. 20 years ago, popular culture offered us the movies Ghost and The Sixth Sense. Those movies supposed how spirits of dead persons remain in our midst in order to correct injustice or to comfort the bereaved. More recently, there's the zombie phenomenon, giving another kind of explanation of what happens after folks die. And to balance that out, we have the superhero movies that tell us these great beings from beyond is going to protect us against fierce enemies. They're all mythologies, human attempts to explain the unknown, and to entertain. We also in the church dabble in the speculative when we twist the Bible to say things that fit an explanation we seek. I suggest the entire Left Behind narrative does this. The narration mangles supposed prophetic passages by making use of a non-biblical template to force an interpretation that is wrong. Time today doesn't allow me to go into great detail, but I would point out that prior to the middle of the 19th century, no one used the Bible as a code book to crack in order to tell us what's going to happen in the future. It's not what the Bible was given for. Finally, there is the sad truth surrounding the best-selling book, Heaven is for Real. Promoted as a little boy's outstanding trip to heaven and back, we now know the book was an elaborate hoax. Colton, the child in the story, now a teenager, confessed to his pastor earlier this year, and along with the pastor and his mother, gave an interview to a Christian magazine explaining how his father crafted the story and promoted it. Colton lives restricted to a wheelchair. However, his faith is firmly rooted, and he resolutely believes heaven exists. However, he could no longer permit a falsehood to detract from the true reason we live with hope. That true reason is best expressed by the author to the book of Hebrews, who wrote succinctly and powerfully, the fundamental fact of existence is that this trust in God, this faith, is the firm foundation under everything that makes life worth living. It's our handle on what we can't see. The act of faith is what distinguished our ancestors, set them apart from the crowd. Those who disparage faith insert the adjective blind as if to say it's a leap into darkness, rather than what it really is. Faith is taking hold of the personal relationship God offers us through Jesus Christ. Faith is the gift God gives us when that relationship began through the waters of baptism, and our lives are marked with the sign of the cross and the seal of the Holy Spirit. By faith, we trust God is present with us and for us. And that relationship that God began doesn't end when our heart stops beating. This morning, I want to give you 4 truths to take home. Maybe memorize, hold on to. They're especially helpful in the middle of the night when fears like to assail us. Here's the first truth. God is love. God is love. That is the word John, the one-time teenager disciple, now an old man, wrote to his dear children when they faced persecution. Also, the first century church planner and teacher, Paul, offers a similar assurance when he wrote, "Who will separate us from the love of Christ? Will hardship, distress, persecution, famine, nakedness, peril, sword, death? No. Nothing has power to separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus." Second, humans are mortal. We are. Now, just as Ponce de Leon marched through the Florida Peninsula searching for the fountain of youth, we do the same thing through various ointments and treatments and pills. My mother, now 85, wrapped it up so succinctly when she tells me, as she has told me for the last 20 years, "I believe in the natural look. It just takes longer in front of the mirror to achieve it." A friend of mine who is an oncologist often gets asked the how long question. She always begins her answer by explaining every person she knows is terminal, and then addresses her views on living life while battling disease. Being a person of faith, she also looks for an opportunity to inject the promise of the gospel. Yes, we are mortal. And whether the cause of death is disease, accident, or wearing out, there comes a moment when each of us exhales for the last time. But as already set forth, God has given us the promise that this relationship began in baptism continues beyond the grave. Third, Jesus is the way. The Lazarus event demonstrated the authority the Father gave the Son over death. And what took place when Lazarus was raised from the grave was a resuscitation. One day, Lazarus, Mary, Martha's sisters, all of the disciples died. And their bodies degraded in the grave, as ours will. However, Jesus made a promise that day that remains for us. I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me will live, even though they die. And those who live and believe in me will never die. Finally, perfected love prevails. Despite all of the speculation and mythology about what heaven is like, we really know little about heaven. However, what we know is sufficient. As John the Divine told persecuted Christians, in heaven, God is going to wipe away your tears. In heaven, there is no more death. There's no more mourning. There's no more pain. Those things have passed away. And ultimately, what we discover is that our experience of love in this life pales in comparison to the love we will experience in heaven. God is love. I am mortal. Jesus is the way. Perfected love prevails. On this All Saints' Day, as we commend to God those near and dear to us who have finished their course in life, we also commend ourselves. And when fears threaten to overwhelm, whether fears for our own health and well-being or fears we have respecting another person, we acknowledge before God our frailties. We're going to get afraid at times. But in acknowledging our frailties, we open ourselves also to the Jesus who is the resurrection and the life. Let us pray.